Final Fantasy II, the epic saga of Cecil, Rosa, and the... Wait, what? That's not Final Fantasy II. This is Final Fantasy II. The Final Fantasy II that young Dan grew up with is actually Final Fantasy IV, as the real Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III were not released in the United States, but rather in Japan. This decision will cause a large amount of confusion for decades to come. Final Fantasy II was released a year after the first, as Final Fantasy I proved to be successful enough to reinvigorate the cash reserves of Square, and they wanted to follow up with a sequel as quickly as possible. The development team for the first 3 games contained some legendary names, but I'd like to highlight one specific developer that deserves some extra attention. 𝐂𝐎𝐍𝐍𝐄𝐓 knew very little about RPGs, but with the director Hironobu Sakaguchi's guidance, he wrote most of the code for the first 3 titles. He would continue to work with Sakaguchi on nearly all of his projects besides Secret of Mana. 𝐂𝐍𝐍𝐄𝐓 was so important to the team that when the visa issues forced him to return to Sacramento during the making of Final Fantasy II and III, the rest of the development team came along with him to California. An interesting tidbit, even though he didn't code Secret of Mana, 𝐂𝐍𝐍𝐄𝐓 would go on to help develop the iconic ring system menuing that is present in Secret of Mana. John Romero, the lead developer of Doom, interviewed 𝐂𝐍𝐍𝐄𝐓 and afterward was quoted saying, "I had just completed a 3-hour video interview with 𝐂𝐻𝐍𝐶𝐍𝐿. I can die now." So, you know when a sequel comes out and it's not only nails the essence of the original, but it far surpasses it? You know, some examples come to mind, like The Godfather 2, Terminator 2, Mega Man 2, Star Fox 64, Earthbound, and I could keep going. Franchises are often built on the success of the second iteration. Not only can it make or break a franchise, in video game development, the failure of a sequel can end a studio. So as we look to the success of Final Fantasy and the damn near endless iterations, you would think that Final Fantasy II was a huge win for Square. Sadly, Final Fantasy II was not that game. Unfortunately, it feels overdesigned, underdeveloped, with a rushed release date, and the limitations of what was conceivable with game design for its time. Overall, the total is less than the sum of its parts. I'm going to do my best to highlight all of the positives of this game, as I don't want the entire review to be negative, because there are so many ideas that were thrown into this game that had amazing potential, but it just didn't quite nail the landing. Now let's first talk about the story of Final Fantasy II. I believe that the story is one of the stronger points of this game. This is one of the first RPGs to have a narrative driving the direction of the player's interaction with the world. The game starts off with the Palamecian Imperial Army invading and slaughtering the parents of the 4 Patreon-named protagonists, Ramen Gaming, Fistel, Johnny Ruin, and Funky Walt Dog. As our 4 protagonists are fleeing the destruction, they are run down by the Empire and left for dead. Our party awakens to find themselves in the town of Altair, where Princess Hilda of Fynn has established a rebel base after her kingdom was invaded by the Palamecian Empire. After our party comes together, they find that Funky Walt Dog is still missing. Fistel seems very concerned as we learn that they are brother and sister. Yes, that is correct. Our party members are not blank character sheets that you rely on to project your own role-playing inspired stories. They are preconceived characters with plot points, relationships, and ideals. Well, kind of. It is at this point that one of the more unique features of the game is presented to the player, the keyword system. Once a player hears an important word from an NPC, like Wild Rose for instance, they are able to ask other key NPCs about that term. The goal was to turn one-sided RPG dialogue into more of a conversation, in an effort to glean information and direct that conversation. Well, once again, kind of. That's at least what it should do in theory. However, in practice, it is simply selecting each keyword till you find the one that resonates with the current NPC that you are conversing with, making the system feel repetitive and unrefined. This is the first of several ideas in Final Fantasy II that would be taken and used later in future games, but often with better implementation. For instance, Shadowrun on the Super Nintendo uses a similar keyword system that just feels a lot more appropriate to that game. But in any case, after obtaining more information in Altair, our party sets north towards Fynn in an effort to find Funky Walt Dog. After leaving the town, we are now introduced to the battle system of Final Fantasy II. And lordy do we have a lot to talk about here. Now fundamentally, combat is no different than Final Fantasy I. Choose an action, choose a target, execute the action. Also, just like its predecessor, if an attack is queued on a dead target, it will prove to be ineffective. However, once the combat is over, we see a drastic divergence from the old leveling system of Final Fantasy I. Now, Final Fantasy II's level-up system boosts stats, weapon, and magic proficiencies based on the individual usage of each. So if you were to attack with a dagger, you might get dagger experience. If you use magic, the spell itself will level up. Now this also impacts the max HP and MP values for your character. If you would like to have more HP total, get hit more. If you would like to have more MP, cast more magic. Now a note is that casting magic outside of combat does not level your MP total. It only increases the level of the spell that you are casting. So if you are like me, and you're trying to optimize your combat and you wait to the end of it to heal everyone up, you will actually be punished with a lower MP pool and cure spells that cost proportionally more MP as it levels up. This means that potentially you could overlevel a spell beyond your max MP and lose the ability to cast it until you have cast other spells in combat to trigger MP skill ups, or you chose to forget the spell, re-buy the spell, and relearn it from level 1. Now speaking of magic, gone are the different levels of magic that we learned in Final Fantasy I. There is no Fire 2, no Fire 3, there's no Fyra or Fyraga. There is just one fire spell, and if you want it to grow in damage, then you had better be ready to cast it a lot. Probably no less than 4 million times. Now, okay, that might be a slight hyperbole, but if you play the game, you will completely understand. Now the inverse is also true. During the game, we get to learn the ultimate magic, Ultima, which makes its first appearance in the franchise. Now we expect this spell to annihilate everything in our path. However, since it is unleveled, it does paltry amounts of damage and needs repeated casting to catch up to our elite physical prowess. Definitely an underwhelming moment in this game. The frustration of the magic system becomes especially apparent about midway through the game when you are forced to fight monsters that are nearly immune to physical damage and weak to magic damage. If you haven't been leveling up your spells, you will find it very tedious to get through these fights. My advice is to level some damage magic early so that you don't find yourself in the same situation that I was, where I couldn't reliably do any damage to the enemies. Also, teach Cure to every party member so that you will have a low-level spell to use to heal up outside of combat, as having a dedicated healer will quickly make Cure your most expensive spell to cast. Having never finished Final Fantasy II before this review, I was unaware that the missing Funky Walt Dog was not going to be joining the party until the very end of the game. My plan, initially, was to make him more of like a black mage, so that I was saving all of my damage spells for him. Obviously, I had to change my plan on the fly when I started to encounter the necessity of having damage magic while not having a combat caster. Yet another quirk to this system is the spell Esuna, where later Final Fantasy games use it as a remedy to all status ailments. Final Fantasy II overcomplicates the spell in quite a frustrating manner. It is broken up into two spells. Now there is Basuna for status ailments that are in battle, so think of it as Battle Asuna, and Asuna for ailments that persist beyond battle. For example, there are two different types of poison, purple and green. Purple will only last during the battle, but green persists on until you cure it or you die. Now if that wasn't enough, Asuna doesn't initially cure all status ailments. The status afflictions Asuna can remove are based on the level of the spell. For example, Petrification requires Asuna to be level 6 in the Pixel Remaster version. So that just means that you spam some MP on a character and level it up, right? Wrong. You have to get the status ailments that you can heal to use it in the first place. It won't let you use Asuna on a character that is healthy. In practice, this means that you're finding enemies that inflict darkness or poison and purposefully getting those status ailments so that you may cast Asuna multiple times to level it up. In my playthrough of the Pixel Remaster version, which is vastly quicker and easier than the original Famicom version, it took me roughly an hour of grinding to get my Asuna high enough to get rid of petrification. The level up system is the kernel of an idea that would be expanded upon in future titles like the Saga series or in Elder Scrolls, famously implementing this concept into a much more functional system. I really like the idea of becoming stronger with what you use. It allows for the greatest flexibility for choosing your playstyle in the game. Now sadly, the flaws in this early implementation greatly outweigh what it did right. For an example, if you really like daggers, the last one drops roughly about 3/4 through the game, severely hampering your ability to continue to scale your damage into the end game. However, Johnny Ruin was a master of the fist, able to punch his way through pretty much any defenses all the way through the game, as he was not reliant on any weapon pickups. A note on this Pixel Remaster version, in my playthrough it appeared as though that the weapon skills were capped based off of the stats of the mobs that we were fighting. So at a certain point, you no longer gained any weapon skill XP till you found stronger enemies to fight. In the original Famicom version, you could literally beat the crap out of yourself endlessly and you were not restricted by the difficulty of the mob, so you could quickly become grossly overpowered and never need to pick up a single weapon. Now as the story progresses, you are met with a revolving cast to take the place of your fourth party member. I like the idea of having someone personally invested in the current task at hand sharing in your adventure. This was definitely a novel concept, as I am personally unaware of any other RPG at the time using a party member in this manner. Now while it seems like a great idea, the implementation is severely lacking. Every single time you get a new party member, and this includes Funky Walt Dog at the end, they are effectively level 1 in almost everything, barring at 1 or 2 skill weapons or maybe a spell. In my playthrough, I would just strip all of them of their weapons and armor, and after they died, I just left them dead. Now, why would I do that, you say? Because when a character joins the party at 500 HP and the enemies are doing 800 plus damage, I just didn't see the point in trying to keep them alive for anything besides taking one hit from our main 3 party members. Sadly, because of the fourth party member constantly being rotated out of the party, it just wasn't worth the time to make them a relevant member of the team. Final Fantasy II has some of the absolute worst dungeon design I have ever seen in a game. The game is full of what best I could describe as amateur Mario Maker game design ideas. Here are 4 doors, or in some cases, even more to choose from. One will take you further into the dungeon, and all of the others will pop you into the center of an empty room. Now you couple this with a very high encounter rate in the game overall, and you have a recipe for frustration. Another point, in the Dreadnought dungeon, we mistakenly took the wrong path. We cleared through 6 floors to find out that we had to go all the way back to talk to the captured Princess Hilda, for the correct trigger, to then go through the same 6 floors again. A dungeon full of creatures that could only be damaged by magic. Dungeons that spawned 6 enemies that all paralyze, stun-locking our group to a slow, inevitable death. Needless to say, it was a very frustrating experience, and honestly, I can't wait for Final Fantasy Maker to come out and see what dungeons my son will make. The pros of having a story-driven plot is that you usually never question where to travel next. In Final Fantasy II, however, the story was locked by NPC story triggers, but I often found myself forgetting where the specific NPC was or confusing them with another. When NPCs only exist as quest markers, it makes remembering their specifics difficult. So I was constantly visiting the same cities, trying all of the keywords, and until I found the specific NPC that locked the next portion of the game. This will be a system used in hundreds of RPGs in the future, but we have such a bare-bones approach to it in Final Fantasy II that it leaves you feeling annoyed when you compare it with future titles. As for the story, it didn't take us long to notice some striking similarities to another famous piece of media from almost a decade prior. In fact, I suggested name change to this one. Final Star Wars, a new fantasy. Seriously though, the parallels between the two stories are pretty staggering. The princess leads a rebellion against an evil empire. She gets captured. The heroes have to sneak inside a big ship. They blow it up from the inside. And look, we even have our own Han Solo that speaks to Wookiees. We didn't realize how similar they were right away, but once we did, it became impossible for us to not see the similarities at every new story beat. Surprisingly, the plot of Final Fantasy II has some very adult themes, specifically for the time. Many members of the rotating cast met untimely deaths, such as failing to dodge a massive stone boulder, or sacrificing themselves. This game even had an implied sex scene between one of the members of our party and Princess Hilda. Now this is definitely a departure from RPG tropes at the time, and it stands as a unique entry in the series in this regard. Being an avid video game music connoisseur, I have yet to talk about the soundtrack to this game. Some of my personal favorites are the Rebels theme, the Overworld main theme, and my absolute favorite, the Castle Pandemonium theme. Which just happens to be the piece that I chose to remix, titled Punching Pandemonia. Now here's a sample. So does Final Fantasy II hold up against today's standards? I'm sorry to say that it does not. I won't say that I disliked my entire playthrough, as there were many parts that I enjoyed, mostly from the Pixel Remaster's quality of life improvements. The faster auto battle, automatic targeting acquisition after an enemy dies, and dual wielding now hits 2 separate enemies if the first dies, speeding along the combat. These improvements made the game much faster to play, which helped offset the frustration that came from the poor implementation of the many new systems that were added. Now, if you are masochistic and want to feel a great deal of pain, by all means play the original Famicom version. If not, I would highly recommend either the PSP version or the new Pixel Remaster version if you plan to submit yourself to this game. The Pixel Remaster at least makes everything a little faster, and the balancing overall was better. If you wanted to get the most out of your Final Fantasy II experience, not that I understand why you would, and you wanted to add an additional story, the Game Boy Advance version Dawn of Souls is the version for you. It comes with the original Final Fantasy as well, which is a gorgeous version, as I previously mentioned in my review of the first game. Final Fantasy II can be best described as unpolished. There's a good game here if all of these different systems would have been refined. It took a lot of risks with the franchise, and many of those risks would pay off down the road. However, it should be noted as well that although it was not released in the United States, Final Fantasy II sold more copies in Japan than the original Final Fantasy I did, so by all means, it was a success for the company. This was not the last time that we would see missteps from the Square dev team. I would like to quote Secret of Mana. "Time flows like a river, and history repeats. But that is a story for a future video." As always, I want to give a big shout out to my patrons for all of your contributions. As you well know, I wouldn't be able to do this without your support. If you're interested in supporting the series and channel, consider checking out my Patreon for benefits like a patron-only chat in my Discord, your name featured in my videos, and music downloads from the entire series of remixes that I am doing. You also get my love and affection, but then again, if you've watched the video up to this point, you already have that. In the next episode, we will be covering the best Final Fantasy of the 8-bit era. So look forward to that. And as always, my young onion kids, praise be to Yevon.